Welcome back. It's incredibly good to have you with us again today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Whether you are prepping for a meeting or catching up on your field or, you're just one of those naturally curious people who loves pulling on a thread to see what unravels, you are in the right place.
Absolutely.
We are taking you on another deep dive today, and the source material we're looking at is, well, it's one of those unexpected gold mines of information.
It really is, because when you first glance at it, it just looks like a standard reference document.
Right.
But once you start looking at the proportions and the actual timelines, a very human narrative starts to emerge from the data.
Today, our mission is to unpack a Wikipedia article detailing the list of United States Senate elections in Colorado. Now, I know,
It sounds dry.
it really does. A massive chronological list of dates, candidate names, and voter turnout numbers spanning from the 1870s all the way to the 2020s sounds like a dusty spreadsheet.
A very long spreadsheet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might be wondering how an encyclopedia table translates into an engaging story. Okay, let's unpack this, because hidden within these raw data points is a gripping century-long record of razor-thin margins, massive population booms, and some truly wild political anomalies.
And what I love about looking at a raw historical ledger like this is that it completely strips away the political noise.
Yeah, the bias is gone.
Right. We aren't here to debate the merits of the Democrats or the Republicans or the various third parties that pop up. We are just looking at the pure math of democracy and what those vote counts tell us about the electorate at that specific time.
We're just data detectives.
Exactly. The data acts as a neutral mirror reflecting the priorities of the voters. We're totally impartial here.
We are just following the numbers. So to get started, let's establish a quick baseline with the mechanics of the Senate, as laid out in the text.
Good idea.
We all know that every state is allotted 2 U.S. senators. But the key structural element that shapes this entire data set is that Senate terms are staggered. They serve 6-year terms, but those terms are broken up into classes.
And because Senate terms are staggered into those classes, this dataset isn't just a single timeline. It is effectively 2 parallel tracks of Colorado history running side by side.
That's a great way to put it.
When Colorado was officially admitted to the Union back in 1876, the state was assigned a Class II seat and a Class III seat.
Right.
The purpose of this system, obviously, is to ensure that only a third of the entire U.S. Senate is up for election every 2 years. It prevents total turnover. So when we look at this list, we're really tracking the evolution of Class II and Class III completely independently.
But the way those early seats were filled, it looks completely foreign compared to modern elections. There's a massive pivot point in our source material right at the year 1913.
Oh, yeah, the 17th Amendment.
Before 1913, you don't see massive popular vote totals in the tables because the state legislatures were the ones actually choosing the senators behind closed doors. Then, 17th Amendment passes.
And everything changes.
Practically overnight, the system shifts to direct election by the voters.
What's fascinating here is how fundamentally that constitutional amendment changes the very nature of the data we are reading.
Totally.
Prior to 1913, a list of senators is essentially a record of political consensus among state-level power brokers. You're looking at backroom deals and legislative majorities.
The establishment.
But the moment you cross that 1913 threshold, the entire nature of the ledger transforms. These tables and percentages become a direct reflection of the public will.
It completely democratizes the spreadsheet. Just imagine being a citizen right at that transition point. You're living in Colorado, and suddenly you have direct, tangible power over a massive federal choice.
That's a huge shift.
And that shift in power leads directly into the actual voter data. And man, did the voters of Colorado make some of these early direct elections incredibly close.
The razor-thin margins are where the statistics really start to show the tension of the era. When you transition to a popular vote, you suddenly introduce the reality that a tiny fraction of the population can literally dictate the direction of the entire state.
I really want to look closely at the tightest races we found in this list, because focusing on the raw numbers grounds the history. Let's pull up the Class III special election in 1932.
Oh, the Schuyler and Walker race.
Yes. You have Carl C. Schuyler, the Republican candidate, and Walter Walker, the Democratic candidate. When the dust settles, Schuyler beats Walker by exactly 1,065 votes out of over 414,000 total votes cast.
That is a margin of about 1/4%.
0.25%. A U.S. Senate seat was decided by barely 1,000 votes. Think about the logistics of that. That is the size of a single neighborhood deciding the federal representation for the entire state.
It really is.
A single rainy day in one specific county, or a localized issue with a polling place somewhere, could have easily flipped the U.S. Senate.
It forces you to reevaluate how we view historical mandates. When we look back, we tend to think of election winners as having a broad consensus of the people backing them.
Right, like the whole state was on board.
Exactly. But this data proves that often there is no broad consensus. There's just a fractured electorate where one side managed to find a tiny handful of extra supporters.
Yeah.
And that 1932 race wasn't a one-off anomaly. The text shows several of these absolute squeakers throughout the century.
You see it again a decade later.
You do. Take the 1942 Class II race.
Yeah.
Democrat Edwin C. Johnson goes up against Republican Ralph Lawrence Carr. Johnson edges him out with roughly 50.2% of the vote compared to Carr's 49.2%.
Wow.
It was a difference of just a few thousand votes. Or you can skip ahead to the 1972 Class II upset.
Oh, that's a good one.
The Democrat, Floyd Haskell, narrowly defeats the incumbent Republican, Gordon Allott. Haskell pulls in about 49.4% to Allott's 48.3%.
Barely 1%.
Exactly. Haskell unseated a sitting senator, a guy who had been there for 3 terms, by a margin of just over 1%.
When you lay those numbers out, it really dismantles the idea that incumbency makes a politician bulletproof. A 1% margin against a 3-term incumbent means the challenger essentially chipped away at the foundation until the whole building collapsed.
It raises an important question, though. Why does this granular level of data from 1932 or 1972 matter to us today?
Right.
In our modern world, we're constantly dealing with information overload and political fatigue. It is incredibly easy to feel like individual actions are just a drop in the ocean.
Very true.
But these historical ledgers prove mathematically that a handful of engaged citizens genuinely tip the scales of history. The data shows that the margin of error in a functioning democracy is often shockingly small.
It makes you wonder how many people stayed home in 1932 thinking their vote wouldn't change anything, completely unaware that 1,000 extra people could have changed the course of the election.
Precisely.
And speaking of data that challenges our assumptions, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the anomaly I found in the Class III data, because it might be the most fascinating narrative in the entire article.
The Ben Nighthorse Campbell era in the 1990s.
Yes. Let's look at the timeline here. In 1992, Ben Nighthorse Campbell runs for the Class III Senate seat representing the Democratic Party. He wins a solid victory, capturing nearly 52% of the vote and beating the Republican challenger, Terry Considine. Campbell goes to Washington as a Democratic senator.
That is a standard entry for the ledger, a solid single-digit margin victory for a major party.
Standard, right. But then, follow that Class III seat to the very next election cycle in 1998. Ben Nighthorse Campbell is up for re-election, and he wins again.
Right.
But he doesn't win as a Democrat. He wins as a Republican. He runs against Democrat Dottie Lamb, and Campbell absolutely crushes it under a completely different party banner.
If you pause and just look at what that implies about the voting public, it is a remarkable piece of data. We don't need the outside historical context or the political backstory of why he switched to see the story here.
No, the numbers say it all.
The raw numbers tell us everything we need to know about candidate charisma versus party infrastructure.
Oh, wait. If Campbell won as a Democrat in 92 and then dominated as a Republican in 98, does the data show his total voter base growing? Or did he just swap one half of the state's voters for the other?
That's the fascinating part. When he ran as a Democrat, he won just over 800,000 votes. When he ran as a Republican 6 years later, he won nearly 830,000 votes, beating Lamb 62.5% to 35%.
So it went up.
Yes. His total vote count actually increased, and his margin of victory exploded. This suggests that a massive chunk of the Colorado electorate was voting for the person, not the party.
That completely upends the conventional wisdom that voters just blindly check the box for their preferred party. To win 52% as a Democrat and then 62% as a Republican means that hundreds of thousands of voters looked at his name, saw a different letter next to it, and said, yeah, I'm still voting for him.
Exactly.
It shows a unique personal relationship between a specific candidate and the voters that totally transcends the party line.
It also highlights how fluid political coalitions can be. Voters aren't monoliths, and we see that fluidity even more clearly when we look beyond the two major parties.
Of the third parties.
Yes. When margins are as tight as that 1932 race we discussed, third-party candidates stop being statistical footnotes and start acting as kingmakers.
The third parties in this text are incredible barometers for what was going on in the country. Let's go all the way back to the 1914 Class 3 race. This is right after the 17th Amendment, so the voters are newly empowered. It was a close race between the Democrat Charles S. Thomas and the Republican Hubert Work. Thomas won with about 40% of the vote. But look at the others column. A progressive candidate named Benjamin Griffith took nearly 11% of the vote, and a socialist candidate named J.C. Griffiths took over 5.5%.
Two third-party candidates pulling over 16% of the total electorate.
Right. Benjamin Griffith and J.C. Griffiths. Practically the same last name, running for two completely different alternative parties, and together siphoning off a massive chunk of the voting base from the establishment candidates.
It's incredible.
And you see a similar disruption a decade later in 1924. This Farmer-Labor Party suddenly appears in the data. In the regular Class 2 election, their candidate Morton Alexander pulls about 5% of the vote. In the special Class 3 election that same year, their candidate Charles T. Phillip pulls over 5.5%.
What is crucial to understand about these alternative party spikes is that they represent shifting cultural and economic priorities. A spreadsheet can't tell you the emotional state of the voters, but it can show you where they are directing their frustration.
Yeah, where the pressure is building.
Exactly. When you see a progressive and a socialist capturing double-digit percentages in 1914, or a Farmer-Labor Party establishing a solid baseline across multiple races in 1924, you are seeing the voters explicitly voicing their demands.
They are essentially telling the major parties, neither of you are addressing our needs, so we are going to park our votes over here until you figure it out.
Exactly. The data captures the mood of the era. It shows that the electorate was deeply concerned with labor rights, agricultural policy, and progressive reform during those decades, even if those third-party candidates didn't actually win the seat.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out and look at the entire century as a single continuous timeline? Because for me, as I was reading through this list, the most shocking thing wasn't the 1,000 vote margins or the party switching.
What was it?
It was the sheer, unbelievable scale of the numbers as time marched forward.
Ah, yes. The tides of turnout. The demographic footprint of the state changes entirely.
Let's compare the total vote counts from those early 1900s races to modern times because it illustrates a fundamentally different logistical reality. Going back to that 1914 Class 3 election with the progressives and the socialists, if you add up every single vote cast across all the parties, you have roughly 250,000 total votes in the entire state of Colorado.
250,000 people participating in the democratic process.
Now, hold that number in your head and fast forward to the 2020 Class 2 election. You have Democrat John Hickenlooper running against Republican Cory Gardner. Hickenlooper pulls in over 1.7 million votes.
Wow.
Gardner gets over 1.4 million votes.
Yeah.
If you combine that with the other candidates, you were looking at over 3.2 million combined votes cast in a single Senate race.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this Wikipedia list isn't just a record of political winners and losers. It is a mathematical timeline of Colorado's population explosion. You can literally trace the state's growth decade by decade just by tracking the rising tide of total ballots cast.
Think about what that means for the candidates themselves. In 1914, a candidate only needed to reach and persuade about 100,000 people to win a Senate seat. You could theoretically travel by train, stop in the major towns, shake enough hands, and build a coalition.
That was the playbook.
But by 2020, you were trying to communicate with over 3 million voters spread across booming metropolitan areas and vast rural counties. The logistical nightmare of campaigning at that scale is hard to comprehend.
The scale of the electorate entirely changes the mechanics of how a politician builds a mandate. And as that population grows into the millions, we also see fascinating patterns in the ebb and flow of power. The data reveals a constant tension between the advantage of incumbency and the volatility of the electorate.
You definitely see long streaks of stability where incumbents seem locked in. Gordon Lalonde is a great example in the Class 2 seat. He wins his first term in 1954, successfully defends it in 1960, and defends it again in 1966.
He was a fixture.
He secures 3 solid terms before that narrow defeat in 1972. Or look at Michael Bennett in the Class 3 seat in more recent history. He wins in 2010, defends in 2016, and defends again in 2022.
The incumbency advantage is real. Voters often prefer the familiar name, or at least the stability that comes with a known quantity. But the data also provides a sharp counter-narrative. Just when a party seems to have established a dynasty, the pendulum swings violently in the other direction.
The recent Class 2 data is the perfect case study for that pendulum swing. Let's trace the last few cycles. In 2008, Democrat Mark Udall wins the seat against Bob Schaefer. Udall gets over 1.2 million votes. So Udall goes to Washington and becomes the incumbent heading into the 2014 election.
Right.
But in 2014, the pendulum swings. Republican Cory Gardner unseats Udall, winning by roughly a 2% margin.
A highly competitive race that unseats an incumbent in a rapidly growing state.
Highly competitive. So now Gardner is the incumbent heading into 2020. He has the advantage of the office, but what
He
happens?
swings again.
The pendulum swings right back. Democrat John Hickenlooper unseats the incumbent Cory Gardner in 2020 by a margin of about 53.5% to 44%. It is this constant shifting battleground. Just when you think a party has a lock on a specific seat, the voters decide to completely change course.
It perfectly illustrates the accountability built into the staggered 6-year term system we discussed at the very beginning. Every 6 years, the incumbent has to return to that ever-changing, rapidly expanding population of 3 million people and ask for their mandate again.
Yeah.
And as the back and forth between Udall, Gardner, and Hickenlooper clearly shows, that mandate is never guaranteed. The electorate is fickle, and their priorities are constantly evolving.
We have covered some serious ground today. Who knew a chronological table of election results could map out so much human behavior?
It is a testament to the fact that data is never just numbers. It is a codified record of choices made by millions of individuals over a century.
Thank you so much for going on this statistical journey with us today. We started with what seemed like a standard reference list, but by unpacking the proportions and the context, we found incredible stories.
So many stories.
We looked at extreme nail-biters decided by a fraction of a percent, explored the fascinating candidate first loyalty of Ben Nighthorse Campbell winning under 2 different party banners, and traced a massive demographic explosion from 250,000 voters to over 3 million.
And before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. As we explored this data today, we naturally focused heavily on the past, the margins of 1932, the third-party disruptions of 1914, the massive modern turnout of 2020.
Right, the history.
But the Wikipedia text explicitly notes something else at the very end of its tables. It states that the next scheduled elections for these Colorado seats are in 2026 for Class 2 and 2028 for Class 3.
The ledger is still open.
That is exactly it. I want you to consider that this historical table we've been analyzing isn't a finished artifact. It is a living, breathing document. Every single time a citizen casts a vote in 2026 or 2028, they aren't just performing a civic duty in the present moment. They're literally adding a digit to a permanent historical ledger. We've spent our time today marveling at the collective decisions made by voters 100 years ago. It leaves you to ponder. What will the data generated in 2026 and 2028 eventually say about our current cultural mood to a curious reader looking back at this exact same list a century from now?
What a fantastic thought to end on. You are writing the next row of the spreadsheet with every ballot. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep pulling on those threads, and we will catch you on the next one.